Hi, I'm Mavis Kerr, and I am an aspiring mother. I live on 8 acres of country property with an amazing amount of biodiversity and a lot of different plants. And I have become aware that this property has a huge number of moths on it because our friend Alan McNaughton has been doing a moth survey. So I've learned a lot about moths. I can tell you that we've gotten up to 707 species. That's not individual moths, that's 707 species on this very small 8-acre property, which has many different habitats on it, which is why we get so many different species, because most of the moths lay their eggs on a specific plant or on a specific group of plants, and the more different plants you have in your setting, the more different kinds of moths you're going to get.
And what is the Nithwit Pits?
Nithwit Pits is the name that I gave this property because we are beside the Nith River. It's because we have an old regenerating, rewilding gravel pit at the back of the property.
So this shows you the old gravel pit, that slope covered in gravel. This was where the gravel pit was. Where I'm standing would be, 20 feet above us would have been the original level of the ground, and none of the trees here were here. They've all seeded in the last 35 years.
And you put that together with the fact that there are nitwits that live here, and you have nithwit pits.
What kind of biodiversity helps the moths on this property?
Well, all biodiversity helps the moths, but in particular on this property, I've lived here for 35 years, and I started about 25 years ago consciously rewilding the property and introducing a lot of native species instead of the pretty flowers that I initially had. I started to specifically look for native plants for my perennial garden. I planted native shrubs and trees, and of course the moths in this area are adapted to lay their eggs on the plants that were here in the first place before we human beings came along and messed things up. And so the more of those native plants that you have on your property, the more likely you are to get native moths.
It's one of my gardens that in the summer is beautiful with all sorts of pink and purple flowers, and many of them are native. But you'll notice in the winter I don't cut it back in the fall. I leave it messy because this is the circumstance that insects, moths included, need to overwinter and be ready to go in the spring, because if you cut all those things back, there's no place for the insects to hide, and the ones that go inside the stalks and pupate in the stalks, they don't have any stalks to go into. So if you can get over the compulsion with having everything look manicured, you can contribute a lot to the insects by leaving your garden messy in the winter.
And people can do this just in their own backyards by just growing native plants, either shrubs, trees, or the small plants that in their flower gardens.
Do you have any favorite moths?
Well, I only actually have, since we started collecting moths on this property and doing the sampling of them in the moth traps, I've only actually, I think, kept one moth, and that's my little hologram moth, which is called a hologram because it, depending on which way the light points at it, it changes shape and color, and it's quite lovely. I used to have a job that involved lasers, and holograms are a product being able to use lasers to take photography, and so it kind of tickled my fancy. But actually, the moths I really like are the ones either with funny names or ones that have really interesting faces, one of the things I learned when we first started to survey the moths was that Alan would take their photograph in a very standardized way, and I found myself wanting to come at them from head on and look at their faces, which are fascinating.
What's something you wish that people knew about moths?
Well, I wish they knew how much fun they were and how interesting they are, and that you can really get into them, so to speak, as a hobby, but more, I think, to get people to know that these species desperately need habitats. They need the place where they live. And in the case of moths, universally, they need specific plants to grow on. And my background's fairly heavily in botany. And so to me, it's an excuse to introduce more different plants on my property and encourage people to come here and learn about it, and hopefully stimulate them to go and get a book by, what's his name, Doug Ptolemy, I think is his name, the guy in the States who thinks everybody should have a native wildland in their backyard. That's what I want to have happen. The other thing that makes moths favorites of mine are names. There are some weird moth names. The bad-winged moth, the owl-eyed bird-dropping moth. Now the interesting thing is that that moth, when you see it on a twig, you really think it's a bird dropping. And then there's like a witch moth. What's it? I think it's called the black witch moth. Here's one, it's called the northern burdock borer. It says it feeds on thistle, common burdock, teasel, and other plants. I wouldn't want a diet of thistle, common burdock, and teasel myself.